Picture this, it's the early 1800s, the American frontier. A land that promised freedom and fortune, but often delivered isolation, hardship, and danger. In those times, families weren't just surviving against the wilderness. Sometimes, they were surviving against something far darker. This is the story of the Hartwell family. A name that, in its time, carried whispers through small towns and dusty trading posts. Whispers about strange happenings, a cursed house, and the shocking fate of 5 women, all wives to the same man, who one by one descended into madness. The frontier setting, immersive historical context. To understand the Hartwells, you need to understand the world they lived in. The frontier wasn't the romantic, wild adventure you see in paintings. It was brutal. Imagine dense, unbroken forests stretching for miles, nights so silent you could hear the cracking of ice on the river 2 miles away, and winters that could trap you indoors for weeks at a time. Frontier homes were built by hand, every nail hammered in after weeks of labor. There was no electricity, no comfort beyond what you could wrestle from the land. Illness was a constant threat, and if you were unlucky, help might be days, even weeks, away. Loneliness wasn't just an emotion. It was a weight that could crush you. For many settlers, that isolation was enough to bend the mind. And for the Hartwell wives, it shattered them completely. Introduction of Thomas Hartwell, the patriarch. Thomas Hartwell arrived on the frontier around 1811, a tall man with a sharp jaw, cold blue eyes, and a reputation for getting what he wanted. People said he came from Virginia, others claimed he had drifted west after trouble, back east, though no one ever dared ask him what that trouble was. He built his homestead far from the nearest settlement, deep in the Kentucky wilderness. By all accounts, he was hardworking, but there was something about him that made neighbors uneasy. Maybe it was the way he avoided church gatherings, or the fact that his property always seemed eerily quiet. The first wife, Mary Holt Hartwell. Mary was just 19 when she married Thomas. The daughter of a merchant, she'd been swept away by his rugged charm and promises of a beautiful life on their own land. At first, things seemed fine. But within a year, Mary began to change. Neighbors recalled seeing her staring out the window for hours, clutching at her skirts like she was waiting for something, or someone. Soon, she began speaking of whispers in the walls, and eyes in the woods, that followed her whenever she went to fetch water. By the second winter, Mary refused to leave her bed. She stopped eating, stopped speaking to anyone except Thomas, and even then, only in hurried whispers. One night in the spring of 1813, she vanished. Thomas told neighbors she had run away to her family, but letters from back east revealed she never arrived. Her disappearance was the first shadow over the Hartwell home. The second wife, Abigail Rowe Hartwell. Only months after Mary's disappearance, Thomas returned from a trip to a nearby trading post with a new wife, Abigail Rowe, a farmer's daughter. Some thought it was indecently soon, others whispered that Thomas seemed in a hurry to replace his bride. Abigail was a sturdy, practical woman, and for a time it seemed like she might withstand the isolation better than Mary had. But by her second year on the property, she too began to unravel. Abigail was found wandering in the woods barefoot in the middle of the night, muttering that she needed to get away before the singing started. She claimed the forest, called to her in a voice that was neither man nor woman, but something older, something cold. The last anyone saw of her, she was walking down the dirt path toward the river in the dead of night, carrying nothing but a candle. The next morning, her footprints stopped at the water's edge. The growing reputation of the Hartwell land. By now, the Hartwell property was spoken of in fearful tones. Travelers avoided the road that ran closest to it. Hunters claimed they'd see strange lights flickering among the trees near the house. One trapper swore he saw Thomas standing in the doorway at midnight, just watching the forest, unmoving for hours. The settlement priest even suggested the land itself might be cursed, an idea Thomas openly mocked. But privately, the locals began calling the place Widow's Hollow. The third wife, Eliza Morton Hartwell, Eliza came from the city. She was educated, refined, and used to conversation and society. At first, she brought laughter back to the Hartwell home. But by her first winter, she too began to fade. She developed an obsession with drawing, hundreds of small, frantic sketches of a single dark figure standing among trees. She swore this figure came closer to the house every night. Her final months were marked by screams that echoed across the valley. The night she died, Thomas claimed she had fallen from the loft. But her body was found outside, almost 20 feet from the house, as if she had leapt in panic. Part 1 cliffhanger. By now, Thomas Hartwell had lost 3 wives in less than a decade, all to madness or mysterious deaths. And yet, he would marry again, and again. Each woman would enter the Hartwell home with hope in her heart, and each would leave broken, raving, or gone forever. In Part 2, we'll uncover what happened to wives 4 and 5, and the chilling truth about the Hartwell family legacy that some say still lingers on that lonely stretch of frontier land. The wind howled across the endless plains, carrying with it the bitter scent of cold earth and wood smoke. It was the year 1874, deep in the untamed American frontier, a land both brimming with promise and poisoned with isolation. The Hartwell homestead sat far from the nearest township, a crooked silhouette against the dying light of the prairie sunset. Jonathan Hartwell had been called many things: a man of grit, a pioneer, a devoted husband, and in whispers, something else entirely. By the time the townsfolk began to take notice, 5 women had entered his home as wives, and 5 had left it in coffins, or in the wild-eyed grasp of madness. The frontier was a place where survival was the only law. Days were consumed by the battle against hunger, cold, and distance. But the Hartwell family's troubles were not those of crops or cattle. They were troubles that grew inside the mind, spreading like rot in the timber walls of their home. Each wife had arrived hopeful. The first, Clara, was a schoolteacher from back east, bright-eyed and eager to start a family. For months, she wrote cheerful letters to her sister about the beauty of the prairie, the way the grass seemed to roll like waves, the way the stars bled into an ocean of black above. But the letters changed. The handwriting grew shaky, the tone frantic. She spoke of shadows moving in the corners, of voices whispering her name in the night. By winter, she had locked herself in the root cellar, screaming at something no one else could see. Clara never left that cellar alive. The second wife, Margaret, swore she would not let loneliness break her. She kept busy, tending chickens, sewing quilts, reading scripture by candlelight. But within a year, she too began to unravel. One evening, the Hartwell neighbors found her barefoot in the snow, mumbling about the man in the field, who wouldn't stop watching her. She vanished the next night. Her body was found days later at the frozen edge of the river, her eyes wide open to the sky. By the time the third wife, Eleanor, arrived, whispers had begun to coil around Jonathan like smoke. Yet somehow, women still came, drawn by his charm, his promises, or perhaps the strange pull of the unknown. Eleanor lasted longer, but her journals, discovered years later, told a story of nightly scratching sounds beneath the floorboards, of a figure at the foot of her bed who vanished when she tried to scream. She burned most of the furniture in the house before the sheriff found her wandering the plains, her skin blistered from the cold and her words incoherent. The 4th and 5th wives followed the same road, one taken by delirium and fits, the other by a silent withdrawal that ended in a noose in the barn. And through it all, Jonathan Hartwell remained. His eyes always calm, his voice always steady. Too steady. The townsfolk began to whisper that the land itself was cursed, that the soil beneath the Hartwell home was stained with something older than any settler. Some swore that the place had once been a sacred burial ground. Others claimed Jonathan's great-grandfather had been involved in darker things, pacts sealed with blood under moonlight. Yet the truth, whatever it was, never came to light. When the railroads pushed further west, the Hartwell home was abandoned. The roof caved in. The walls buckled. But travelers crossing the prairie say that on certain nights, when the wind cuts sharp and cold, the house stands whole again, lamplight glowing in its windows. Some swear they've seen a woman's face in the glass, mouthing a single word over and over: help! And perhaps, out there in the endless quiet of the frontier, the Hartwell wives are still waiting. For over a century, the Hartwell home has been left to the mercy of the wind and time, a collapsing carcass of splintered wood and rusted hinges. But the stories never stopped. People in the nearest town still warn travelers not to go near the old prairie road after sunset. I didn't listen. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a folder full of newspaper clippings, I set out to find the truth behind the legend, and the 5 women who lost their minds within those walls. The prairie at night feels different. The horizon disappears. The sky presses down heavy and black. And then, there it was. The house. Not a ruin, but whole. Standing tall against the wind, its windows glowing faintly. At first, I thought I was seeing things, a trick of the dark, maybe my flashlight reflecting. But when I stepped closer, the air around me dropped in temperature so sharply it hurt to breathe. The front door was ajar. It was impossible, but inside, the furniture was intact. The walls gleamed with fresh paint. The smell of bread baking drifted from the kitchen. That's when I heard it. The sound of someone humming upstairs. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But the humming grew louder, and it was a tune I recognized, an old folk song mentioned in Eleanor Hartwell's journals. My boots creaked against the wooden steps as I climbed. The second-floor hallway stretched out longer than it should have. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, following me. One door at the end stood half open. I pushed it wider. 5 women stood inside. They were dressed in different fashions, each from a different era, but their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and glistening. They didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in perfect unison, they turned their heads toward me. "Help us," they whispered. The room went black. When I woke, I was lying in the dirt where the house's ruins should have been. My camera was smashed. My watch was broken. But clenched in my hand was something I had not taken there, a small silver locket. Inside was a faded photograph of all 5 wives standing beside Jonathan Hartwell. And in the background of that photo, at the far window, was my own face. The townsfolk tell me I shouldn't have gone there. They tell me the Hartwell wives don't like visitors. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that same humming outside my door, and I think they've found me. The wind howled across the endless plains, carrying with it the bitter scent of cold earth and wood smoke. It was the year 1874, deep in the untamed American frontier, a land brimming with promise yet poisoned with isolation. The Hartwell homestead stood far from the nearest township, a crooked silhouette against the dying light of the prairie sunset. Jonathan Hartwell had been called many things: a man of grit, a pioneer, a devoted husband, and in whispers something far darker. By the time the townsfolk began to truly notice, 5 women had entered his home as wives, and 5 had left it either in coffins or in the wild-eyed grasp of madness. Life on the frontier was a daily battle against hunger, cold, and distance. But the Hartwell troubles were not those of crops or cattle. They grew inside the mind, spreading like rot in the timber walls of the home. The first wife, Clara, arrived with hope in her heart. A schoolteacher from back east, she wrote cheerful letters about the beauty of the prairie. But her tone changed. Her script grew frantic. She spoke of shadows moving in the corners, of whispers calling her name. By winter, she had locked herself in the root cellar, screaming at something no one else could see. She never left it alive. Margaret, the second wife, vowed loneliness would not break her. But one night she was found barefoot in the snow, mumbling about. The man in the field, who watched her. Days later, her body lay frozen by the river bank, eyes fixed on the sky. Eleanor, the third, lasted longest, but her journals told of scratching beneath the floorboards and a figure at her bed's foot. She burned most of the furniture before being found wandering the plains, frostbitten and incoherent. The fourth succumbed to violent fits. The fifth ended her life silently in the barn. Jonathan Hartwell, through it all, remained calm, too calm. Some whispered the land was cursed, others claimed Jonathan's bloodline was tied to something ancient and dark. The truth never surfaced. When the railroads came, the Hartwell home was abandoned. Yet travelers say that on certain nights, the house stands whole again, lamplight glowing in its windows, and a pale face in the glass mouths a single word: help. Out there in the endless quiet of the frontier, the Hartwell wives may still be waiting. The wind howled across the endless plains, carrying the bitter scent of cold earth and wood smoke. The Hartwell story had long since faded from newspapers, but its ghost still lingered, both in the memories of the townsfolk and in the records buried deep in dusty archives. After years of whispered tales, I began piecing together what facts I could. Historical maps showed that the Hartwell land stood near an abandoned burial ground used by early settlers and, before them, native tribes. Old court documents hinted at disputes over the property, disputes laced with accusations of witchcraft and land curses. From census records, I confirmed the names of Jonathan Hartwell's 5 wives: Clara, Margaret, Eleanor, Ruth, and Lydia. Each arrived full of promise. Each met a tragic fate. But the most chilling discovery came from their personal writings, stored in the county archive. The handwriting varied, the eras were different, yet certain lines appeared in every journal. The man in the field is watching. He does not move. He does not blink. Local historians have long debated whether these women fell victim to the crushing isolation of the frontier, a common but often unspoken reality for those who lived miles from any neighbor, or whether something darker was at work. Some point to strange weather records, sudden drops in temperature, violent winds localized only to the Hartwell property. Others note that livestock deaths and crop failures seem to plague only that farm. Paranormal investigators who visited the ruins in the 1980s reported cold spots, untraceable voices on their recordings, and the distinct scent of burning wood inside the long-collapsed house. One photograph, taken from outside, appeared to show 5 shadowy figures in an upstairs window. To this day, travelers along the old prairie road tell the same story. On certain nights, the house appears whole again, light spilling from its windows, the faint sound of a woman humming an old tune. Those who have gone closer say they've seen faces in the glass, pale, unblinking, mouthing a single word: help. Whether curse, madness, or something in between, the Hartwell legacy endures. And for those willing to step onto that land, one question remains unanswered. If you see the house standing in the moonlight, will you go inside? It was supposed to be my final visit, one last trip to the Hartwell land to close the book on this story once and for all. Armed with a lantern, a recorder, and the old silver locket I'd found months before, I set out across the moonlit prairie. The wind was still, unnaturally still, as though the land itself was holding its breath. When I reached the ruins, they were just as they should be: collapsed timbers, weeds pushing through the foundation stones. But then, as my boots touched the threshold, the air shifted. The ruins blinked away, and the Hartwell house stood whole before me, glowing warmly as if expecting my arrival. Inside, the scent of bread baking filled the air. The furniture gleamed as though polished that very morning. I called out, but only the creak of the floorboards answered. Then came the humming, soft at first, then louder, weaving through the rooms. I followed it to the staircase, every step a groan under my weight. At the top, the hallway stretched impossibly long. At its end, the familiar half-open door waited. When I entered, the room was lit by lamplight, and there they stood: Clara, Margaret, Eleanor, Ruth, and Lydia. Each wore the clothing of her time, each pale as bone, each watching me with eyes that reflected no light. In unison, they raised their hands, palms out, as if to warn me away. Then they spoke, voices overlapping into a hollow chorus. "He's still here!" Before I could move, the temperature plummeted. A shadow unfolded from the corner, tall, faceless, the outline of a man who seemed made from the darkness itself. The wives stepped aside, and the shadow advanced. My lantern flickered and died. When I came to, I was lying in the dirt outside the ruins. The locket was gone. My recorder, however, still worked, and on it was the humming, clear and close, followed by a whisper that froze my blood. "You're ours now. The Hartwell house has not appeared to me again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear that same humming outside my door, and I know the story isn't finished." It was supposed to be my final visit, one last trip to the Hartwell land to close the book on the nightmare once and for all. I carried only a lantern, a recorder, and the old silver locket I had found months before. The prairie lay under a pale moon, silent and unnervingly still, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The ruins appeared exactly as they should, sagging timbers, weeds pushing through crumbling stones. But the moment my boots crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The ruins dissolved, and the Hartwell house stood whole before me, its windows glowing with a warm, unnatural light, as if it had been waiting. Inside, the scent of baking bread filled the air. Every surface gleamed, polished to a shine. The air was warm, yet a chill crept beneath my skin. I called out, but only the creak of the floorboards answered. Then came the humming, faint at first, then winding around me like a rope, leading me toward the stairs. At the top, the hallway stretched far longer than it should. The familiar half-open door awaited at the end. I stepped inside, and lamplight revealed them: Clara, Margaret, Eleanor, Ruth, and Lydia. Each in the clothing of her own era, each pale as frost, each watching me with eyes that reflected no light. In perfect unison, they lifted their hands, palms outward, as if to warn me away. Then they spoke, voices overlapping into a single hollow chorus. "He's still here!" From the corner, a shape began to emerge, tall, faceless, and impossibly dark, as though the shadows themselves had taken form. The wives stepped aside, and the figure advanced. The air turned icy. My lantern guttered, then died. When I awoke, I was sprawled in the dirt outside the ruins. The locket was gone. My recorder still worked, but what it captured chilled me to my core, the same humming, close to the microphone, followed by a whisper. "You're ours now. The Hartwell house has not appeared to me since. But sometimes, when the wind is still and the night deep, I hear that same humming outside my door. And I know the story is far from over." For decades, the Hartwell legend has been dismissed by skeptics as nothing more than a ghost story spun from prairie folklore. But the deeper you dig, the more unsettling the details become, details rooted in the very real, very harsh history of the American frontier. The Hartwell homestead stood in what was then a lawless stretch of unsettled plains during the late 1800s. Isolation was more than a hardship. It was a breeding ground for psychological collapse. Historical records from neighboring townships describe settlers driven to madness by loneliness, starvation, and brutal winters. But the Hartwell cases were different. The wives' declines were rapid, violent, and eerily similar despite occurring years apart. Archived marriage records confirm Jonathan Hartwell wed 5 women between 1871 and 1888, each from different states, each with no known family in the region. Census data shows that after each wife's disappearance or death, Jonathan remained in the home, never remarrying until the next arrival. Newspaper clippings from the time detail strange happenings, reports of eerie lights over the property, unexplained livestock deaths, and sightings of a tall figure in the wheat fields. Local indigenous oral histories add another layer. Elders from the nearest tribal settlement have long told of a place on the prairie where the boundary between the living and the dead thinned, a place where a man once made an unholy bargain to protect his land from drought, sealing it with the life force of those closest to him. The location in their stories matches almost exactly where the Hartwell homestead stood. In 1937, a team of WPA surveyors noted a set of hand-dug tunnels beneath the property, filled with bones both animal and human. No official report was filed. The notes survive only in private collections, passed quietly between local historians. Even in the modern day, satellite imaging has shown anomalies on the site, temperature fluctuations, inexplicable magnetic readings, and on one occasion, a fleeting structure where the ruins should be. Whether Jonathan Hartwell was a victim of the land, a man cursed by his own choices, or something far worse, one fact remains: every woman who entered his home met a fate of terror and madness. And as the old settlers used to say, the prairie keeps its dead close, but its secrets closer still. When it comes to the Hartwell family, separating fact from folklore is like trying to sift gold from muddy river water. There's truth in there, but it's buried deep. The story of Jonathan Hartwell and his 5 wives begins in the 1870s, during one of the most dangerous and lonely times on the American frontier. Records show Jonathan Hartwell did, in fact, purchase 200 acres of prairie land in 1872, about 20 miles from the nearest township. The official documents still exist in the county archives. But after that, the trail grows murky. Local census records list a female Hartwell in the household every few years, each with a different first name. By 1885, no women are recorded at the property at all. So what happened? Theory 1. The land was cursed *** before the Hartwells. The area was home to a small, now forgotten indigenous settlement. Archaeologists have confirmed burial mounds less than half a mile from where the Hartwell home stood. Could Jonathan have unknowingly, or deliberately, built on sacred ground? Some say the wives were driven mad by the land itself, plagued by visions and voices from something ancient that never forgave the intrusion. Theory 2. Jonathan Hartwell's secret ***. Some researchers point to a series of letters written by Jonathan's younger brother, Samuel. In them, Samuel warns a friend in town that Jonathan has taken to locking the doors at night, not to keep people out, but to keep something in. Was Jonathan protecting his wives from an outside danger? Or hiding the fact that he was the danger? Theory 3. The prairie isolation effect ***. Frontier life was brutal, especially for women. With no neighbors for miles, no medical care, and long winters trapped indoors, mental breakdowns were tragically common. Historians note that cases of what they called prairie madness appeared in numerous pioneer accounts. Could the Hartwell wives have simply been victims of extreme isolation, with their stories twisted over time into a legend of curses and ghosts? But then there's the locket. ***. The strangest evidence of all appeared in 1974, when a group of urban explorers claimed to have found a silver locket in the ruins of the Hartwell house. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Jonathan with all 5 wives, the other a blurry image of an unknown man in modern clothing, standing in the window. The locket vanished shortly after, stolen from a private collection. But the photographs? No one can explain them. So was the Hartwell tragedy a simple case of bad luck and harder living? Or is something still watching from those empty plains, waiting for another curious soul to wander too close? Maybe we'll never know for sure. But if you ever find yourself driving the old prairie road at night, and you see a faint light in the distance, don't stop. If you want, I can also make part 10. Survivor's account. Told as if someone actually escaped the Hartwell house and is giving a first-person interview. That would push the realism and the creep factor even higher. Do you want me to make that next?